Hey everyone, it is time for another recitation, this time on the GitHub Cards project using class-based components. So, the basic requirements for this project is that we are going to, with class-based components, query the GitHub API for information about a user, display that user's data in some form of card component, fetch the user's follower information, and then display that information on the page. I want to be very clear here, we do not have to make cards for each follower, especially because the data returned from the follower's endpoint is different than the data returned from the user endpoint. So we're going to have to manage those slightly separately. I know that was a pain point for a lot of you yesterday. So I have on my left side here, you can see I already have my Yarn server running, and I've already run create React app. So this is my directory with the project README in it, and then I ran create React app, and I created my React app in this user card directory. But let's say I don't want this. I don't want it in this subdirectory that really serves no purpose. Well, it's an easy fix. I'm going to go down here to my terminal, and I'm going to stop my Yarn server. Right now I am in the user card directory. We can see my React project lives here. But I want to move everything out of user card and into the root of my repository. The way I can do that, it's very easy. There's a command in Bash called mv, short for move. It allows us to move and rename files. What I want to do is I want to move all of the contents of user card, which I do with user card /star. And this represents everything in user card. Star is a special character, and it will expand, it will match every single file. So every file in user card, I want to move to where I currently am, /. So when I run this command, it's going to move all the files from user card, our entire React app, into the root of the repository. And we did it. Now, now all my stuff is here, and I can safely remove the user card directly with the rmdir command. Oh, it is not empty. Did the readme not move? Oh, the gitignore file is in here. So I'll move the .gitignore up a level with // and now I can use rmdir to remove my user card directory, and rmdir will not let you remove a directory unless it's empty, so it's a very safe command. So now my React project is in the root of my repo, and I don't have to deal with it being in a subdirectory when I deploy to Netlify or anything like that. I can start my React server up again with yarn start, and then I have my project in my browser. And this is just a straight create React app. So I want to show you what you're safe to be able to delete. So if you go into source, we have this server worker.js. Not going to use it, can get rid of it. The logo.svg, not going to use it, I can get rid of it. So I'll delete both of those. The problem is we now get errors because the default React app depends on those files. So if we go into index.js, where we try to import service worker, where it doesn't exist anymore, just going to get rid of that. Also going to get rid of the reference to it down below. And then inside of our app.js, I'm just going to clear out everything from in here because I don't need it. And then I'm also going to remove the reference where we're trying to import the logo. Yay, so now I have a clean React app to start with without any files that I don't really care about. You can also clear out the CSS files in the same way, but I'm going to leave them here in case I want to add stuff later. Alright, so our first step here is going to be to rewrite our app as a class-based component. It's easy enough. I'm going to do class app extends react.component. I'm going to have it define a render function, which is going to return the JSX that I want, which is just going to be this empty div for now. And there we go. That's it. I don't really need to define my constructor function if I'm not really doing anything in there, but I will because I want to define my state. So I'm going to define my constructor function, and then I'm going to set up my initial state as an object, and then I'm going to have the user be in here under a key called user, and I'm just going to set it to be an empty object for now. Okay, so now we want to, I have to call super if I'm gonna define my constructor. You gotta call super in there. This is a good error. I know not all the React errors are incredibly helpful, but this one is good. Must call super constructor before using this in derived class constructor. So I don't know exactly what that means necessarily, but it says must call super, and I didn't call super. So pretty safe bet that I need to add a call to super in there. Alright, so now I have my initial state, and I want to fetch data from the GitHub API and put that into my application state. The issue is, I'm not sure where to do this, because in a functional component, we would do that inside of a use effect, right? Because we would only want that to run once. When we first render our app, when our app is mounted. If I just put it in my functional component, just right, in that main scope, then it would keep rerunning that request every time we render our component, and then the API would ban us, and that would be sad. So I don't want to put it here within my render function, because that's essentially the same as doing it in the main scope of a functional component. We'll run it every time the component renders. That's not what we want. It's also not really a good idea to put it inside the constructor. Instead, replacing our use effect is the lifecycle methods. Component did or component will, and there's a bunch of iterations of them, and you can and should read the React documentation about all of them. But the one we want is component did mount. This is a function that will get run when the component is mounted, when it's first created and it's first put into our application. So if I want to do something once at the start of my component's life, then I do it inside of component did mount. So this is where I'm going to make my request. I didn't have the foresight to install Axios before I began, and I don't want to do it now, so it might be a good idea to use fetch, which fetch is not a Reactism. Fetch is built into the browsers. So we always have access to fetch, as long as we're running our application in a modern version of a web browser. So I'm going to use fetch. And the way fetch works is a little bit different than Axios. We're still going to give it the URL that we want it to fetch, or we want it to make a request to. In this case, it's going to be api.github.com/users, and then the user we want, which that's going to be me. So what we would do with an Axios request is we'd put a .then on it, and I would get the response, and I might as well console log this response object. And let's take a look inside of our developer console and see what we get. So if we look in here, we have our response object, and it's looking good. I got my status code, the URL I wanted, I wasn't redirected. But notice there is no .data. There's no data key like we would have in an Axios request. That's because the response object that fetch gives us back is just that. It's just the information about our response. If we want the data that came back with it, we have to process that. Fetch will not do that by default. So there is see these prototype methods that are on this object? There is one of them called JSON, which is a function that will parse the JSON so that we can get the data that was given back with our request. So I would do res.json. The problem is that this method, res.json, also returns a promise. So if I want to get the data out of it, I can't do it right here. If I console log it, we see that I literally get a promise. So some of you might go, oh, well, I can, put a dot then here, and you're not wrong. You're not wrong. But because of the nature of this callback, using this implicit return, I am returning the result of running res.json. So instead of putting my dot then in there and kind of nesting my code deeper and deeper and deeper, I can put my dot then out here. And this is where I will get my data, and I can console log this data. So now I see in my developer console, I see my data object that has all the data about my GitHub user. Some of you might be wondering, well, what if I didn't know all of those weird tricks? Well, that's where you gotta read documentation. I didn't know how to use fetch, so I just Googled MDN fetch. And it gives you this big page that has a lot of stuff in it with no examples. So I'm not going to tell you to skip it. If I were you, I would read it, even if you don't understand every word on this page or understand everything that it's talking about, or even if they're not really relevant to what you're trying to do. It's a good idea to read documentation thoroughly, because later, if you see these words again, suddenly a connection forms in your brain, and you start building understanding. You have to start somewhere on these unknown topics, and one of my favorite places to do that is just by reading whole pages of documentation. But if we scroll down to the bottom, they do have this very nice article for us using fetch, and this gives us an example on how to use fetch. So, read your documentation. It's good. Alright, any questions with this so far? Okay, I'm not seeing anyone typing in the after party channel, so I'm going to keep going. I'm sorry, what was that?
I said I have a question. So yesterday, people were using, let me see, I still have it somewhere on my computer, fetch user and fetch follower. So they were doing this dot fetch user, this dot fetch follower in the component did mount.
Yes.
What is the difference between what some people were doing and what you did?
So if I were to try to do like this dot fetch user, this wouldn't work, because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to call a method on my object called fetchUser, which isn't defined. So what they did, and what we will do later, is instead of just doing this fetch directly, we'll define it inside of a member function on our object. So we can call that in component did mount, and then we can also call that in other places, perhaps in a component did update, or as the result of submitting some form, or something like that. So,
awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's how I had mine yesterday too.
Yeah.
Like the other way, not this way.
Yep. And it's probably a better idea when you have this logic that you're going to use more than once to put it in a function and call that function again. I'm just doing it directly here because I want to go through the process of like getting this working and then, kind of cleaning it up and showing why we would do it that way. Because if I do it, the correct way, the first time, then we don't really learn our lesson. So,
awesome.
Yeah.
Super helpful.
Okay.
Hey, Henry, sorry,
Yes.
one more question. Could you explain, just because I didn't do this yesterday and it didn't seem to give me much problem, but why do you have res.json? Can you explain again what the .json is?
So if
rather
you're
than just fetching .data?
If you're using Axios, this is not necessary. Because what Axios does is it performs the request, and it also notices the JSON returned with the request. And that's actually just going to be a string. You know how when we're working with local storage and stuff, we have to JSON.stringify our stuff before we store it in local storage? Well, we can't send a JavaScript object over the internet, because that's an abstract concept in our computer's memory. So what the server does is it literally turns, whatever data it has into a string, and that gets sent to the user. And it's honestly, coincidence is a bad word, but it doesn't have to be a JSON object. It could be XML. It could just be a literal string. It could be some other form of data, like an EDN object. And so Axios automatically takes care of noticing if that string is JSON and then parsing it into an object that we're ready to use, but fetch does no such thing. With fetch, if I console log this response object, which this is also a neat trick to console log something if you don't want to add a function body. If we console log that response object, and I get it right here and expand it, there is no .data. There is no .data in here. If I want to get the data returned with my response, I have to tell this response object that I want that. And I do that with this member function .json, which in and of itself is a promise. That takes some time. I don't want to block all of my code waiting for this JSON to be parsed. So I call res.json. That's going to parse the JSON in the request, and I chain a .then on there, and now I get my data. This is a step that Axios does for us under the hood, but when we're using fetch, we have to do it ourselves.
Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Any other questions?
Also, Henry,
Yes.
yeah. So, how would we compare useEffect with component did mount?
So this component did mount. This will only run when our component is mounted, which in our React lifecycle, that's when we first make our component and put it onto our page. So this is roughly analogous, not roughly, it's pretty closely the same as useEffect, then, whatever callback function we want, and giving it this empty dependency array. So when we do this in our functional component, whatever callback this is will only run once. We'll only do that the first time our component is rendered. And component did mount the same way, will only run the first time our component is rendered. It will not continue to run each time we render the function. So, very similar to our useEffect with the empty dependency array. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, great. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Well, now that I have my data, I just don't want to console log it. I want to save it into my state so that I can use it elsewhere. Because right now it's stuck inside of my .then. So if I want it, I have to perform some side effect. I have to save it into a variable. And we're going to use our this.setState function. And I'm going to put it inside of this user key that I already have set up. So I'm going to do that with this.setState. And I'm going to give it an object. And I'm going to set the value of user to be the data that I got back from my API. And now I have it within my state. Well, what if I want to see that? I saw a lot of people do this as well, where they went, okay, so after my fetch request, I want to console log this.state. But what we're going to see here is our initial state object. And that's because fetch or an Axios request, they're asynchronous. So when the JavaScript on our page is running, they'll kick off this request, but it's a promise, so it'll start running in the background. It'll move forward, and it will then do my console log immediately before I've gotten my response back from my server. So it's going to console log the initial state, not the state that we get once we've finished our request. So what can I do? Well, I can be tricky, and I can put this inside of my render, because I know the render function is going to run every time we re-render our component, which is something that we force to happen whenever we call this.setState. So if I look here, now I have the user object that I have gotten back from the API. However, this is not something that I want to do in render. This is something that I really want to do inside of another lifecycle method. Component did update. And this is a lifecycle method that runs every time our component's state is updated, and we re-render it. So every time we re-render the component, whether the data it's getting from props or the data it's getting from state change or something else forces a re-render, React is going to run component did update. So now we'll also see that this console log is going to run initially. I guess this is one slight difference from useEffect. So this will not run on the first render of our component. This only runs on re-renders. So component did mount. So component did mount is going to run on the first render. We see that here. And then on our second render, after we've called this .setState, component did update is going to run. And now we get our state object console logged. So component did update runs on every re-render. And I'll talk more about this later when I do the search stretch implementation. But for now, I have my user data in my state. I'm going to render it to my page really quickly because I'm a little bit crunched on time here. I'm just going to define the user card component right here within app.js, which is generally not something you should do. You should make it its own component file and import it, but I'm taking a shortcut here. I don't need to use a functional component here because it doesn't involve state. Even before hooks, we wrote functional components when they didn't need to have state. If they were just dumb, if they just took in data and rendered it to JSX, then yeah, we'd use a functional component. Hooks really added the ability to use functional components when they needed to have state. But either way, our user card doesn't need to have state. I'm just going to make it a div. I'm going to look inside this user object and I'm going to see what I want to render. So let's make an h2 and we'll do props dot. I assume I'm going to pass in a user object as a prop. Let's do props.user.login and then p will do props.user. I don't think I have a bio. I don't. So what do we want to use here? Let's just put my URL in there. Oh, location, sure. Let's do location. And now I can render this within my component. So I'm going to render user card. And I expect a prop called user, right? I've already decided to start using a prop called user. So I'm going to give it a prop called user, and I'm going to give it the value of user within my state variable. So now, when our app renders, and once we get the data back from the API, we see this show up in our page. Yay! Wonderful. All right, any questions here?
Could you have just put a return in your first render of just create a div and then do what you did in the function? Like, did you have to create a function for this?
No, I could have done this right within here. I could have just made this div, and instead of doing props, I could have, replaced this with props with this dot state.
Okay.
And this also would have worked exactly the same. I need to remove this reference to user card. And this is getting mad. This is turning into a much longer example than I anticipated. No, it's fine.
No, that's fine. Thank you. That's all I wanted to.
Yeah, and it does the same thing. But generally, I want to separate the logic of getting my data from the presentation from it, if I can help it. Because this will let me very easily change the way my user card works without worrying about, the complexities of getting data in there. Yeah. Okay, so now I also want to get my follower information, which I can do by fetching the URL after my user, followers. And I don't want to put this in user. I'm going to put this in another key in my state object called followers, which I'm going to make an empty array, because it's going to be an array of the user data for each follower, although it's going to be pared down compared to the user object I get when querying a user directly from the API. So I make the same request structure, but this time to a different URL. I parse the JSON, but this time I'm going to set this data into followers. And now we can see within my state array, we now see we've console logged this object twice. And that's because we now have two set states occurring. One when my request finishes getting my user data, and the other when the follower request finishes. And it looks like the follower requests actually finished first, even though they're presented in the other order. That is the nature of promises. So if I look in here, it's an array of objects that have information about each one of my followers. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pass this to my user card as a prop. I'm going to give it a prop called followers. I'm going to set this equal to this.state.followers. And then within here, I will, I'll make a div, and then I will map over props.followers. And for each one of these, I'm going to get a follower object, and then I'm going to make a div. I'm going to give it a unique key, which almost always is going to be something like follower.id, in which case, yes, all of these do have unique IDs. And then I'm just going to have it display the follower name, which it looks like is it follower.login. And let me clean this up just a smidge. And there we go. And now my 30 followers come in, which, I don't know, does that seem kind of low to any of you? Man, we have 21 people in this chat, so I guess if all of you were following me, that makes sense. But, you know, not sure all of you are. Are you really grateful for these sessions? I don't know. I don't mean to, you know, point anything out.
I'm really surprised I'm not following you.
I'm just kidding. I don't really understand the purpose of following someone on GitHub. Like, am I supposed to post statuses like, yo, coding all day, hashtag code life? I don't know.
Hey, it looks like Ace is following you, which means you've got to be pretty good.
Yeah, I've got to be. Well, Asa was my TL for a short period of time, so I assume that's why, not because of my own ability. Yeah, these are actually 3 of my old TLs right here. Okay.
But don't you get updates from people that you follow?
Yeah, I mean, you do. I know it has a purpose, but it's like I'm not making rad open source contributions that you want to check out, at least not right now, so.
You can do GitHub stories.
Oh, can you?
No, that's a joke
Oh.
that everyone's copying.
I would.
Snapchat story.
I would.
Everything.
I mean, yeah, every service has stories now, so I would not be surprised if I could be like.
Even YouTube now.
All right. Okay. Enough. This is fun, but we're about to hit project time, and this is technically MVP, but I really, really, really want to do the search because that involves component did update, and I want you to see how we use component did update because I want you to love useEffect, because useEffect makes my enjoyment of React just skyrocket because it makes me not have to write component did update logic. So. I'm going to spin up a real quick form component. I'm going to do it as a class-based component. So let's call this search, and it's going to extend react.component. We're going to render some JSX. I'm going to return a form element. And in here, we're going to have an input, type is text, Its name is going to be search. Its placeholder is going to be search. And then I'm also going to have a button of type submit and search for a user. Great. So I'm going to do all of my good state stuff. I'm going to define a constructor function, takes in props, pass it to super, and then I'm going to define my state, which is going to have a key the same name as the name on my input form. It's going to be an empty string to start with. And then I'm going to hook that up as the value of my input. And let me organize this a little bit nicer. So then this form is going to have its value be tied to this .state.search. I'm going to write my handle change function, which is going to take in an event. And then I'm going to call this .setState. I'm going to change the value of my event.target.name. And I'm going to set it to be event.target.value. And then I'm going to use this handler for my onChange events on my input. And this .handle change. Okay, so then let me render my search component. So now I have my little search form, and I can type into it, and it goes into my state, and that's all good and bog standard and whatnot. But what I want to happen is when I search for a user, I want it to change the user I have displayed here to someone else. So I'm going to have to make a couple changes in my app. First, I should store the username as a string within my state, because I'm going to want that to change over time. And then I'm going to have to modify. Yes, Joshua, I could make two columns, one for followers and the other for following if I made requests to the API like that, but I didn't. So I'm just doing followers right now. And now that my username is being stored in my state, I want to change my fetch requests to go out and get the person at this .state.username. And I'm going to do the same modification on my followers request. So now I have my fetch request set up to dynamically use this username. I'm also going to write a member function on my app that will change the username. So I'm going to call it, why not, change username. And this is going to be a function that is going to take in a username. And all it's going to do is it's going to call this .setState, and it's going to set the value of username to be the username that I was given. If we ever have this situation where the key name and the variable name that holds that value is the same thing, you can do that. And it works exactly the same. So I'm going to use that trick because I can. And now I'm going to pass this as a prop down to my search form. So let's just keep it the same name, change username, and I'll give it this .change username. So then within my search form, I want to trigger this on submit. So I'm going to have to write a handle submit function, which is going to take in my event. It's going to call event.preventDefault right there. And then I am also going to call this .props.changeUsername. And I'm going to give it the value of this .state.search. And then I'm also going to clear the value of my form. So I'm going to call this .setState. And I'm going to set the value of search to be an empty string again so that my form clears. And I'm going to have to add the handle submit as the onSubmit handler for my form. I saw some people putting the submit handler as an onClick event on the button, that works, and that's something that you'll have to do in the case that, you know, you have multiple buttons that you want to do different things within your form and you don't want to do it in the submit handler. But the advantage of putting it on this form is that now if I click this button will fire a submit event, which will get handled by my handle submit thing. But also if I hit enter inside of my input, that will also fire a submit event, which get handled by my submit handler. So it gives us a little bit nicer functionality than just giving it an on click to the button. Okay, so I know I'm doing a lot here, but let's see, do I have everything set up? I should have it set up so that when I submit my form, I call change username, which changes the username in my state, which should allow me to go and get another user, right? Let's see if that works. So I can type in here, let's, who do we want to get? Let's get Nisa. Let's see what Nisa is up to. And I'm going to submit my form, and nothing seemed to happen. But notice in my component did update, which this lifecycle method runs every time we update our state, I'm console logging my state. And if I see here, I did indeed change the username to Nisa. But why didn't my fetch request rerun? Well, that's because they're inside of component did mount. And that only runs the first time my component is rendered on, you know, when we mount this component onto our page, when we create it. So even though I changed, you know, username and these fetch requests are getting the username from state, they're not going to run again. And even though this is analogous to useEffect with this empty dependency array, with useEffect, all it would take to get this to work is add the username to the dependency array, and then suddenly this would rerun whenever the username changed. And that's why I love useEffect, and that hooks are my favorite thing. In class-based components, we have to jump through an extra hoop involving this component did update lifecycle method, because this runs every time the props or the states or whatever forces a re-render. And component did update actually takes two arguments: the previous props and the previous state. So if I want to have something happen, let's say when the username in my state changes, I have to write an if statement. And I'll check if the previous state's username doesn't equal my current state's username, then inside this if statement, I want to do something. I want to rerun my fetch requests. And this is where it suddenly becomes a good idea, instead of copy and pasting these things, to put these inside their own functions. So I'm going to declare some additional member functions. Let's do fetch user, and that is just going to perform my fetch request for the user, and then I'll also define fetch followers, and that is going to perform the fetch request to get the followers. And I'll call these inside of component did mount, because I still want to get those when I mount my component. But then I also want to call them inside of component did update whenever my username has changed. So now let's see if this works. So I get me initially. Let's grab Nisa again, and now when I search, the username updates. That triggers component did update. It sees that the username within the previous state is different than my current username within state, and then it reruns the requests to get Nisa's information. So that was a ton. What questions do we have at this point?
Yeah, what if you took away the condition and component did update?
Perfect. I am not actually going to do that, because that will cause an infinite loop. Because component did update runs every time we call this dot set state every time we change our state. So what's going to happen is if I took these away, then every time our component updates, we're going to call fetch user and fetch followers, which is going to hit the API, which is going to set our state, which is going to trigger a re-render, which is going to run component did update, which is going to call fetch user and fetch followers, which is going to hit the API, it's going to set our state, and now we've entered an infinite loop and the API bans us. I don't want to do that. We can simulate that happening by watch what happens if I just put like this dot set state, and I'll just have a counter in here, and I'll make it, you know, this dot state dot counter +1. And then let me add a counter into here. Yeah, so then React straight up notices that we're in an infinite loop and cuts us off. Maximum update depth exceeded. This can happen when a component repeatedly calls set state within component will update or component did update. Look at that. That's a great error message. Yeah, so that's what happens when you call, you know, something that sets state in component did update without a conditional in there, because it will just continually rerun component did update. So we don't want to do that. We need this conditional. If we don't have the conditional, it's basically the same as in our functional components if I were to put these directly within the scope of my function and trigger that infinite loop that way. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And this error message triggered another question. What's the use case the component will update?
So component will update, I believe, I'm not an expert on the React lifecycle by any means. A component will update is triggered when something would cause a re-render, you know, like state and props changing, but then the re-render doesn't actually happen because either like, oh, it turns out the props didn't update, or it's not necessary to re-render this component for some reason. But I would refer to the docs. React docs component will update. Or it might just be the hook that occurs, not the hook, the lifecycle method that occurs when the update is going to happen, but before it actually has, whereas component that update is the other one. So let's see. Maybe component will update is deprecated as well. Oh. Aha. It is now called unsafe component will update. So this lifecycle was previously named component will update, and they deprecated it, and instead you should use different ones. So component will update is invoked just before rendering when new props or state are being received. So you could perform preparations before the render, as opposed to component did update. Component did update. So this is invoked immediately after updating occurs. This method is not called for the initial render. Yay. So there you go. React docs. Read them. And Carlos asked in Slack, will we have access to this code? Yes, I always post the code up on GitHub along with the recording when I'm done. Okay, do we have any other questions here? There's got to be a question or two. Right? I just did a ton of stuff. Kevin just said, good thing we're all following you. Yes, that is actually a valid use case for following me on GitHub. So if component did mouse is analogous to use effect with the empty dependency array, then this manual if statement inside of component did update is analogous to a use effect where we're checking this .state.username for changes. So that is something to notice. And if I wanted to do more, conditional stuff, then I have to write more if statements. Or in useEffect, if I wanted to have this depend on more variables, like let's say a page number, well then I have to write a more complicated if statement. So if this changes, or, prev state dot pages is not equal to, and I kind of have to build this logic out sideways, whereas useEffect takes care of this quite nicely for us. And I really enjoy useEffect, and I hope you all appreciate it just that much more. All right. Any questions?
Hey, Henry, I came in a little late, and this isn't related to what you just went over, but when we're creating a React app within a folder or a directory that we've cloned, is that what you covered at the beginning?
That is what I covered, yes. How to move that out into the root of our project, because we don't really need that subdirectory there for us.
When we do that, do we need to touch, are there any dependencies that need to exist in like the folder that we have moved that into, or do all of the dependencies need to exist in that subfolder of the React app we created? So
the idea is that when we run create React app, it makes a folder for us that has all these things in us. A get ignore, a package.json, public, a readme, source. And then when we run yarn install or npm install, we create node modules, which is all of the dependencies. But the contents of this folder can be anywhere on our computer to work. They don't have to be in a folder named user card or whatever you decided when you ran create React app. So you can just pick up the contents of this folder and move it anywhere else that you want to. So what I did is I had a folder called user card. And in a terminal, let me make a new terminal. I ran this command. I did move user card /star, which stands for the entire contents of user card, /. So that moves everything from user card into my current directory, which is the root of my repository. And yay, now I have a React app in the root of my repository. If you wanted to, you could also just run create React app somewhere else on your computer and then move the files into this GitHub repo. Same deal. Just got to have all those files.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right. Any other questions?
Could you also use a run create React app and then the space period and just create it in that folder, or does that not work for that?
That might totally work. I've never done that, so I don't know.
I've actually done that, and that worked.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, then you can run, npx create React app or whatever method you use to create your React apps. And then instead of giving it a subdirectory name, you can just use the current directory. So that's pretty neat. I learned something new today.
Hey, that'd be a first. Way to go, Amir.
All right.
All right. Any other questions?
Oh, yeah. Can you go ahead and refactor everything into Formic? Thanks.
Oh, yeah, sure. No problem. No, I'm not going to do your future projects. Okay, so some people had asked me about doing the sorting hat project. I obviously don't have time to do that today, but I was thinking maybe next Monday I could do that, because I don't normally have anything to do during lunch on Mondays except, eat my food like a normal person. So would that be something useful that you all would like to see?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Then next Monday I will do a special recitation on the sorting hat project, which I'm not going to show the code that I wrote when I tried to do it as a student, because it is very bad. Okay. Well, I think that's it for today's recitation. Thank you all so much for coming, and I'll see you later.